General suffers disdain from racist man during flight, but when the man discovers the general's true identity, the situation changes completely. Marcus Thompson settled comfortably into the leather seat of first class, admiring the airplane's luxurious cabin. The soft glow of the lights and the aroma of fresh coffee created a welcoming atmosphere, but he was far from feeling completely at ease. The African-American general, a respected hero, was on his way to Washington, where he would receive a medal in recognition of his service. Nervousness mixed with the confidence that always accompanied him, and he was determined to make the most of that moment. As he observed the other passengers taking their seats, the cabin door opened, and Robert Miller, a middle-aged white businessman, entered. The forced smile on Miller's face quickly faded upon noticing who was seated next to him. A look of disdain crossed his face as he sat down, clearly uncomfortable, as if Marcus's presence was an affront. "First class, huh? Nice to see things are changing," he commented sarcastically, casting a mix of contempt and incredulity toward Marcus. Marcus, having decided to ignore the provocation, focused his attention on a book he had brought along. The title, Leadership in Difficult Times, reflected his life philosophy. However, the tension in the air was palpable. He could feel Miller's glare burning into his skin, as if the businessman were challenging him to respond. But Marcus knew it wasn't worth feeding that flame. "You know, it's not every day you see someone like you here," Miller continued, breaking the silence. "I bet you got that seat through some kind of racial favoritism. After all, who else would be willing to take a spot like this without having to work hard for it?" Marcus lifted his eyes from the book, meeting Miller's arrogant gaze. The general took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. "I earned this seat through my work and achievements, not because of my skin color. Everyone has their own journey, and mine hasn't been easy," he replied, his voice firm and resolute. The other passengers in the cabin, who had until then been indifferent, began to pay attention to the exchange. An older man in a corner watched with concern, recalling his own experiences with racism in his youth. He felt an urge to intervene, but hesitated, aware that his voice might not be heard amidst the growing hostility. Miller, unsatisfied, decided to escalate the provocation. "Oh, sure, everyone has a story. But in the end, that's all it is, a story. I bet if you asked anyone here, they wouldn't remember your name. Nobody cares about the deeds of a black general." Marcus looked out the window, trying to ignore the anger building within him. The plane began to ascend, the city of New York receding into the distance, as he struggled to maintain his composure. "What matters is that each of our stories contributes to our future. I'm here to serve as an example, not just for those who admire me, but for those still fighting against prejudice. It's not easy, but it's necessary," he responded, his voice steady yet calm, challenging Miller's hostility. The tension continued to mount. First class, which should have been a space of comfort and privilege, transformed into a verbal battlefield. The expressions of the other passengers varied between discomfort and silent approval for Marcus. Meanwhile, Miller became increasingly isolated in his own arrogance, unaware that his hostility was merely exposing his own moral failings. And so, as the plane soared through the skies, the struggle of egos and prejudices unfolded in the cabin, leaving everyone anxious about what might happen next. The flight progressed smoothly, but the atmosphere in first class was far from peaceful. General Marcus Thompson, a respected African-American hero, gazed out the window, watching the clouds spread out. He was in a moment of reflection, about to receive a medal for his service to the nation. The anticipation surged within him, but the peace he sought was abruptly interrupted. Robert Miller, the businessman who had joined him, was trying to settle into his seat, visibly uncomfortable. Looking at Marcus, disdain reflected on his face. "I don't know how you got a spot here," he said with a sarcastic tone. "I guess this is a miracle of the diversity that everyone is so obsessed with." Marcus turned his gaze back to the book he held, attempting to ignore the comment. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and some passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but most remained silent, as if complicity in ignoring the situation could maintain peace. Meanwhile, the flight attendant passed through the aisle, oblivious to the emotional charge building between the two men. Frustrated by Marcus's indifference, Miller decided to escalate his provocations. You must have some kind of racial favoritism to be here, he continued with a cynical smile. It's not common to see people like you at the top, right? I don't need any favors, sir. My work and dedication speak for themselves, Marcus replied, maintaining his composure. His voice was firm yet calm, reflecting the dignity he had always carried throughout his life. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I won't let you diminish that. Before we continue with this exciting story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories, and let us know which city you're watching this video from in the comments. Miller laughed, but there was an insecurity in his laughter. Oh, sure, the good old speech. But who are you trying to fool? It's easy to brag when your life is full of privileges. Miller's hostility grew, and Marcus, realizing the situation could spiral out of control, chose not to give in to the provocation. He looked out the window again, but the atmosphere around him became increasingly tense. The other passengers, who had previously been oblivious to the situation, were now watching with concern. An elderly man sitting in the row ahead turned discreetly, his eyes reflecting a past filled with similar experiences. He remembered his youth when he faced racism head-on, but felt powerless to intervene. Miller, noticing the attention he was drawing, decided to raise the stakes. They say you were one of the first to hold a prominent position. So Stuart, I bet you only got this because you were in the right place at the right time, didn't you? His voice dripped with sarcasm and malice. If you really want to know, it was a continuous effort and a fight against prejudices like yours that got me here, Marcus replied, his calmness serving as a shield against the hostility. And no, it wasn't luck. It was hard work. A murmur began to spread among the passengers, and the elderly man who had remained silent until now finally spoke up. You, sir, don't know what it means to fight for respect. General Thompson is an example of perseverance and dignity. You should be ashamed of yourself. Miller, now cornered, glanced around, realizing he had lost the support of most people. He tried to change seats, but the flight attendant approached him. I'm sorry, sir, but there are no available seats in first class, he said, attempting to maintain neutrality, but with a look that seemed to condemn Miller's attitude. Miller's frustration grew, and anger mixed with shame. He felt like a fish out of water, surrounded by people who admired the man he despised. Meanwhile, Marcus remained silent, focused on his reading, ignoring the commotion forming around him. He knew that the real battle was not just against one man's words, but against the deep-seated prejudice in society. The flight continued smoothly, with passengers settled in their seats, when the tension between Marcus Thompson and Robert Miller began to reach alarming levels. The general, a man of imposing presence, remained calm and centered, while Miller, the businessman sitting next to him, seemed increasingly agitated. After a brief silence, Miller decided to attack again. So, General, Miller began with a sarcastic smile that didn't reach his eyes, tell me, do you really believe your success is due to your own effort? Or maybe you got a little help for being, well, you know. Marcus looked at the man beside him with an almost supernatural calm. He had faced this kind of racism before and knew that the best response was dignity. I've worked hard to get where I am. Every achievement I've reached is the result of effort and dedication. You should know that given your own success, Marcus replied, his voice firm and controlled. Miller, however, was not satisfied with the response. He shook his head in disbelief, as if trying to invalidate Marcus's words. Ah, of course, the good old meritocracy speech. Don't make me laugh. It's funny how things work, isn't it? There's always a special place reserved for some, and I doubt you got here just because of your skills. The other passengers around began to notice the escalating tension. A young man sitting nearby pulled out his phone and started filming the interaction, while others whispered among themselves, some silently expressing their disapproval through their expressions. Aware of the attention on them, Marcus decided to maintain his composure. If you think I'm here because of some kind of privilege, then you really don't understand the struggle that many of us face. I am the first in my family to serve in the armed forces, and believe me, it wasn't easy. Every step was a challenge, Marcus said, his voice now echoing the firmness of his conviction. Miller laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. Sorry, General, but you can't convince me that there's no bias in your favor. Look around you. You don't belong in this environment, and everyone here knows it. What have you done to deserve being in first class? besides taking advantage of your skin color?" Indignation began to bubble within Marcus, but he took a deep breath. "I belong in this environment just as much as you do, Robert, and the color of my skin does not define my ability or worth. If you had the same willingness to look beyond appearances, maybe you could learn something." The murmurs among the other passengers grew, and the tension felt almost palpable. In a corner of the cabin, an elderly man watched the scene with concern, recalling his own encounters with racism in his youth. He wanted to intervene but hesitated, fearing his voice wouldn't be enough to dismantle the poison Miller was spreading. "Do you really think insulting me in this way will change anything? I am a man of principles, and I am respected for that. You can try to undermine my life, but you cannot erase what I have achieved," Marcus continued, his voice now more intense but still controlled. Miller, now visibly frustrated, decided to intensify his hostility. "Principles? You talk about principles while sitting in a place that, in your mind, is reserved for people like you. What are you really, General? A symbol of how lost society is? Don't tell me you don't see that." It was at that moment that a group of young people began recording the interaction, drawing even more attention to the confrontation. Marcus could feel the pressure building, but instead of succumbing to anger, he chose wisdom. "I am a man who has worked to be respected, not just for myself but for all who face injustice. And you, Robert, need to understand that your words have consequences. Respect is not something you buy, it's something you earn." Marcus's gaze was firm, and he knew that at that moment he was not just defending himself, but everyone who had been marginalized by ignorance. Miller, on the other hand, seemed increasingly isolated, the sarcastic smile fading from his face as reality began to sink in. The flight moved forward with a gentle sway as clouds gathered on the horizon. Marcus Thompson sat back in his seat, looking out the window and letting his mind wander. Deep down, agitation accompanied him, but he knew he couldn't allow it to affect him. The escalating tension between him and the man beside him, Robert Miller, was palpable. As the plane sliced through the clouds, the scene around him began to blur, and Marcus started to remember his journey. He recalled his early steps in the military career, when he was still a young cadet, anxious and insecure, trying to assert himself in an environment rife with prejudice. "You won't make it, Marcus. This isn't your place," a colleague's voice whispered in his mind. He remembered the pain, the loneliness, and the constant struggle to prove he deserved to be there, just like anyone else. "Look, your place is in the kitchen, not here in the war room." A bitter memory came to him, a cruel phrase uttered by a superior who didn't believe in his potential. But instead of giving up, Marcus had turned every insult into fuel. He worked tirelessly, studying, training, and surpassing not only the expectations of his superiors, but also his own. And now, years later, here he was, about to receive a medal for bravery and service. On the opposite side, Robert Miller, lost in thought, reflected on sitting next to a man like that. How is it possible that someone like him has come so far? He pondered, unaware of the contradiction in his beliefs. He viewed himself as a pillar of success, a man who had built his empire through hard work and dedication. However, the idea that society was fair and meritocratic began to waver in his mind. He could not comprehend how someone who seemed so different from him could achieve the same level of recognition. "Don't you feel a bit out of place here?" Miller shot back, trying to provoke. But Marcus, with the calm he was known for, paid no mind. "Actually, I feel like I'm exactly where I should be," Marcus replied with a serene smile. "My place is here just like anyone else's." The conversation intensified, and Miller, increasingly frustrated, launched provocative questions. "So, do you really think you achieved all this just by merit? Or was it just because you're, well, different?" Taking a deep breath, Marcus decided not to let the man's ignorance affect him. "I worked hard, much harder than you can imagine. Every step I took was a struggle. What you see here is the result of immense effort and determination," he replied firmly, looking Miller straight in the eye. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and other passengers started to take notice, some with expressions of disapproval, others with curiosity. Marcus felt the weight of the situation, but also a growing silent support from his fellow travelers. He glanced at an elderly man who appeared to be following the discussion with a worried look on his face. The old man shook his head, recalling his own experiences with discrimination, but chose not to intervene. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside the airplane seemed to shift. Miller's provocations grew bolder, and Marcus's indignation surged. He realized that despite being surrounded by people, there was a profound loneliness in the way Miller looked at him. The disconnect between them was vast, and each exchanged word seemed to deepen that divide. "You must have had some luck in your career, right?" Miller insisted, but Marcus, with a firm gaze, replied, "Luck is just the intersection of preparation and opportunity. I prepared for my entire life, and now I'm here ready to receive what I deserve." At that moment, the two men were in different worlds. Marcus wrapped in his memories of overcoming adversity, and Miller, trapped in his limiting beliefs. Each man's internal struggle reflected their realities, and as the plane continued its flight toward Washington, the tension between them became a microcosm of the larger fight against prejudice and ignorance permeating society. The flight began its descent toward Washington Airport, and the tension in first class was almost tangible. Marcus Thompson stared out the window, watching the clouds disperse while his heart raced with anticipation of receiving a medal for his valorous service. This was the moment he had fought so hard for, but beside him, Robert Miller was far from sharing the same spirit. Feeling the pressure of the impending landing, the businessman started to fidget in his seat, the expression of disdain still plastered on his face. "Don't you think it's time for you to show everyone what you really can do?" Miller commented, breaking the silence with a provocative tone. "What did you do to deserve being here after all? Do you really think a guy like you got this far on his own merit?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath to maintain his composure. "I got here because I worked hard, Mr. Miller. It wasn't because of racial favoritism, as you suggest." His voice was steady but calm. He didn't want to be drawn into hostility. Miller laughed, but it was an empty laugh, laden with arrogance. "You really believe that? That all those years of service and sacrifice were enough? I know how things work. You and I both know life isn't that fair." He turned to the other passengers, seeking support in their gazes, but most averted their eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. As the plane approached the runway, the mood in the cabin slowly began to shift. The murmurs of disapproval from the passengers started to grow louder, and some began recording the interaction with their phones, drawn in by the rising tension. Marcus noticed a group of young people watching him with admiration, and that gave him renewed energy. "You can think what you want, but I'm a man of principles," Marcus said, maintaining an upright posture, his eyes locked on Miller. "And I won't let your words undermine me. Every step I took, every challenge I faced, was to claim my place here. That's respect, and you should learn what that means." Miller, in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation, began speaking more superficially. "Well, it's nice to see you have a bit of confidence. That's something you need, especially when you're surrounded by people who don't think like you." He forced a smile, but there was a restlessness in his gaze. Marcus, sensing the change in tone, opted to remain silent, admiring the swiftly passing landscape outside the window. He felt the approval of the other passengers, which encouraged him to keep his dignity intact. The flight attendant passed by, and Marcus noticed a subtle nod of respect in his direction, a gesture that spoke volumes. "Do you really think you can get away with a smile and a joke?" Miller pressed, frustration seeping into his voice. "People won't just forget what you are." "Maybe not, but they will remember what I did," Marcus replied, staring directly at Miller, his eyes reflecting a mix of determination and compassion. "And one day you might realize that respect isn't earned through disdain, but through actions." The plane finally began to touch down, and as the passengers prepared to disembark, the atmosphere was shifting. The reporter, who had been silent throughout the flight, finally stood up, approaching Marcus. "General Thompson, could you clarify your next mission and what this medal represents to you?" The question echoed in the cabin, and the change of focus gave Marcus a new opportunity to shine. He turned to the reporter, his eyes sparkling with pride. "So of course I'm honored to share the story of our work and the importance of serving our country. The medal is a symbol of everyone who fought alongside me and who believes in equality and respect." Meanwhile, Miller, sitting next to him, noticed that the atmosphere had changed drastically. The disdain he had harbored was now transforming into a feeling of shame, and he found himself isolated in his own rage. What he thought he had control over was now slipping through his fingers. The plane began its descent toward Washington Airport, and the tension and anticipation inside the cabin were palpable. Marcus Thompson looked out the window, watching the clouds dissipate and the city reveal itself under the afternoon sun. He felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. It was an important day for him, a celebration of his achievements and an opportunity to inspire others with his story of overcoming adversity. However, the presence of Robert Miller beside him, with his shallow and prejudiced comments, had turned the journey into a true ordeal. Miller, now visibly nervous, tried to change his demeanor. He took a deep breath, attempting to mask the discomfort he felt. The idea that Marcus was a national hero had yet to fully register in his mind. He glanced sideways, observing Thompson's calm demeanor, which seemed oblivious to his presence. The businessman, who had revealed his true nature throughout the flight, was now trying to redeem himself in some way. "Listen, Marcus," he began, his voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say that you really did a good job, you know. This medal you're going to receive, you truly deserve it." Marcus turned slowly to meet his gaze, his expression unchanged. "Thank you, Robert. But it's not just about a medal. It's about the lives that have been impacted by my actions and the example I can set for others." His voice was firm, yet contained a calmness that challenged the previous hostility. He didn't want to stoop to Miller's level, but he also didn't feel the need to feel inferior. Miller swallowed hard, shame beginning to seep into his words. I just wasn't prepared to see a man like you here, you know. Not that I think you don't deserve it, but it's hard for me to understand." He shook his head, clearly confused. "Society is changing so rapidly, and sometimes I feel lost." "Lost?" Marcus repeated almost incredulously. "Lost is what many of us have felt throughout our lives, Robert. I've spent my entire life proving my worth, facing prejudice and discrimination. You can't just feel lost and use that as an excuse for what you said. What you feel is a reflection of your own ignorance." At that moment, reality began to penetrate Miller's consciousness. He looked around, noticing some passengers watching him with disapproval. The elderly man in the row ahead, who had witnessed the interaction, now regarded him disapprovingly, as if to say, "You need to understand this." The pressure mounted on his shoulders, and he felt small. When the plane finally landed, and the passengers began to rise, Miller remained seated, hesitant. Marcus stood up with dignity, straightening his uniform, and started to head for the exit. However, something made him pause. He looked back at Miller, who still seemed lost in thought, and said, "True courage isn't just about winning external battles, but also about facing your own internal failures. I hope that one day you can do that." Miller felt a lump in his throat and couldn't respond. He merely nodded, shame consuming him. As he stood up, he watched Marcus being surrounded by a group of military officials who greeted him warmly. The scene was a stark contrast to his own solitude. As Marcus received applause, Miller felt increasingly isolated, almost invisible. Marcus's walk toward the exit was marked by the reverence of those who recognized him. He greeted some passengers who applauded, while Miller, in the background, watched the scene, feeling increasingly humiliated by his... As he turned away, he couldn't help but feel he had lost something far more valuable than his privileged position. He had lost the chance to be a better person, someone who could respect and learn from others. As Marcus received congratulations and made his way to the exit with a smile on his face, Miller lingered behind, quietly reflecting on Thompson's words and the transformation beginning to take root within him, even though he still didn't know how to take the first step. The press conference was scheduled to occur in the airport lobby, a spacious and well-lit area where a horde of journalists gathered, all eager to hear the words of General Marcus Thompson. He had quickly become the center of attention after the flight that would undoubtedly be etched in the memory of everyone on board. As the reporters organized themselves, Marcus adjusted his tie and took a deep breath, aware of the significance of the moment he was about to experience. When he was finally called to speak, a murmur of anticipation swept through the room. He positioned himself in front of the microphone, his gaze serene yet firm, reflecting the dignity he always carried. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice clear. "Today I don't want to talk just about myself, but about all of us, and the challenges we face as a society. What happened on the flight is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of a larger problem that still persists in our country." The journalists listened intently, some furiously taking notes. A reporter raised her hand and asked, "General, how did you feel about being subjected to racist comments during the flight? That must have been very difficult." Marcus smiled slightly, but there was a weight in his expression. "I hardly let empty words get me down. What really bothers me is knowing that in the 21st century, there are still people who believe that a human being's worth can be measured by the color of their skin. That is unacceptable." As he spoke, Robert Miller, watching from a distance, felt like an intruder among a crowd that now revered Marcus, the figure he had belittled just hours before. The look of humiliation on his face was unmistakable. He stepped back a bit, avoiding the gaze of those who recognized him, and murmured about his behavior during the flight. Another reporter, bolder, asked a pointed question. "General, do you believe that this kind of behavior can change? Is there hope for people like Robert Miller?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, reflecting on the question. "I believe change begins with education and the willingness to listen. If we are open to dialogue, we can find a path to reconciliation. All of us have the capacity to change, but it takes courage to acknowledge our mistakes." Marcus's words resonated in the terminal. He became the voice of a new hope, and the people around him began to comment on the transformation they were witnessing. "He truly is a hero," whispered an elderly woman, watching with admiration. "And what dignity! He didn't let it get to him." At that moment, the woman approached Marcus after the press conference, gently touching his arm. "General, I need to tell you that your attitude during that flight was inspiring. I've faced prejudice in my life too. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of dignity and respect." Marcus smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you very much. Your words mean a lot to me. We must continue to fight together for a better world." Meanwhile, Miller isolated himself further, listening to the conversations around him. "He is a true leader," said a man nearby, unaware of Miller's presence. The businessman felt small and insignificant, as if he were in a bubble that stretched with every compliment Marcus received. The press conference was nearing its end, and Marcus, noticing the attention he continued to receive, gestured for everyone to be quiet. "I want everyone here to reflect on what we can do together. Prejudice is not a matter of skin color, but of character, and all of us have the power to change that narrative." He looked around, capturing the attention of everyone, including Miller, who now felt increasingly ashamed. "Empathy and respect are fundamental. Let's work together to ensure that future generations won't have to face the same kind of hostility that many of us have already encountered. True strength lies in unity." Applause echoed through the terminal, and surrounded by admirers, Marcus felt that his message had penetrated something deep within people. Meanwhile, in the corner, Miller withdrew his head down, reflecting on the transformation occurring before his eyes and his role in what had happened. Robert Miller was home, sitting at the kitchen table, and a weight seemed to settle in his chest. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the day had stretched on for weeks. He looked at his wife Sarah, who was preparing dinner, and felt a mix of shame and confusion. Marcus Thompson's words still echoed in his mind, like an insistent echo that wouldn't let him rest. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. She stopped what she was doing, turning to him with a concerned expression. "What happened, Rob? You seem different." Sarah wiped her hands with a dish towel and approached him. On the flight, I met a man, a general. He's a hero. And I was an idiot," Robert confessed, frustration evident in his tone. "I was arrogant and racist. I made despicable comments." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression becoming more serious. "What exactly did you say?" I insinuated that he was only there because of racial favoritism. I don't know what got into me. He's a dignified man, and The words failed, and he looked away, unable to face the reality he had created. I acted like a complete fool. Rob, this is very serious. You know that racism is a problem in our society. You can't just ignore it and expect it to go away. Her voice was firm, but not aggressive. She had always been the voice of reason in his life, and now it seemed like he had disappointed not only himself, but her as well. I know, I'm starting to realize, but how could I think like that? How could I be so blind? He ran his hands through his hair, feeling anguished. And the worst part, it's not just me. My family. My children. What am I teaching them? Rob, you need to reflect on this. What you believe, what you teach, that shapes who they will become. You need to be an example for them. Sarah's gaze was penetrating, and he felt the truth in her words like a sharp blade. I tried to justify my behavior, but now all I feel is shame. And that situation on the plane, all those passengers, and especially that old man who did nothing. He saw what I did, and yet he remained silent. I don't want that to become the norm in our home, he said, his voice choked. Sarah stepped closer, placing her hand on his shoulder. You can change, Rob. We all can. It's not easy, but it's possible. You have to commit to being better, to learn from your mistakes. And how do I do that? How can I correct what I've done? Robert felt lost, as if navigating through unfamiliar waters. Start by talking to your children. Teach them about respect, about the importance of equality, and not just in words, but show it through your actions. You can also start getting involved in causes that promote racial equality. That could be a good start, Sarah suggested, determination in her voice. He nodded, feeling a spark of hope arise. You're right. I need to do something. I need to redeem myself. I can't stand by while I perpetuate this cycle of hate and ignorance. The conversation continued, but Robert knew he was only at the beginning of a long journey. The discomfort he felt was not just from the shame he had experienced, but from the recognition that his beliefs were wrong. He had a choice to make: continue hiding behind his old ideas or face the truth, not just for himself but for his family and for society. That night, as he prepared for bed, he looked at Sarah and felt the need to be a better man. With a deep sigh, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let shame be his destiny, but rather the catalyst for change. The road wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to find it. Marcus Thompson stood on the illuminated stage, surrounded by colleagues and admirers. The awards ceremony honoring his achievements in military service was a sea of applause and smiles. He looked out at the audience, where familiar faces mingled with strangers, all there to celebrate his accomplishments. In the back of his mind, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He remembered the tense flight, Robert Miller's disdain, and how it only reinforced his determination to be an example of dignity and resilience. Today, I am not here just to receive this medal, Marcus began, his voice firm and clear. I am here to remind all of us of the importance of equality and respect. Each of us carries a story, and often those stories are shaped by the challenges we overcome. He paused, observing the audience's reaction, who listened intently. If each of us commits to fighting against prejudice and discrimination, we can create a better world for future generations. Meanwhile, in his home, Robert Miller sat on the couch, his eyes fixated on the television. His family was gathered around, but he felt distant, almost like a spectator of a life he no longer recognized. The award ceremony was being broadcast live, and seeing Marcus on stage filled him with a wave of shame. The man he had belittled, whom he believed didn't deserve to be in first class, was now being applauded as a national hero. Look, it's him, said his wife Sarah, with a tone of admiration. I read about his achievements. He deserves this. But the words that came out of Miller's mouth were different. He was lucky. It's not fair that a man like him gets so much recognition just because, well, because of his color. Sarah turned to him, her expression one of disappointment. Robert, this kind of thinking is exactly what we're trying to change. Don't you see? He worked hard. He deserves every applause." Miller shrank back in his chair, feeling her words were an attack. "You don't understand. I grew up with these beliefs. It's not easy to just change." "But you need to. Look at him," Sarah retorted, gesturing at the screen. "He's talking about respect and equality, and you're still stuck in the past." Back in the auditorium, Marcus continued to speak, his eloquence captivating the audience. "The fight against prejudice is a daily battle. We must all be agents of change. We cannot remain silent in the face of injustice, as our voice is a powerful weapon." Meanwhile, the image of Miller in his living room began to blur with the weight of his own reflections. He remembered the look of disdain he had thrown at Marcus during the flight, and the humiliation he felt when discovering who Marcus truly was. With the light from the television illuminating his face, he realized that it wasn't just Marcus who was being praised. It was the struggle of all those who faced racism and discrimination. "I don't want my children to grow up thinking this kind of thinking is acceptable," he murmured to himself as the ceremony reached its climax. The image of Marcus, now holding the medal, was a symbol of overcoming that echoed in his mind. "I need to change," he finally declared, more to himself than to anyone else. But the determination in his words was palpable. Meanwhile, Marcus concluded his speech, receiving a standing ovation. He knew his journey was far from over, but he felt that, in some way, his example could inspire others to stand up against injustice. He looked out at the audience and saw not only admirers but also people who could be touched by his story. "Together we can build bridges and fight for a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect," he finished, as the applause echoed through the auditorium, resonating not just as recognition for one man, but as a collective cry for change in a world that still needed healing. Deep down, Miller knew that his own journey was just beginning. He felt a weight in his heart, but also a spark of hope. Transformation was possible, but it would require courage and a commitment he had yet to make. He would turn to his family, and the struggle he would wage within himself was only beginning to unfold. Marcus Thompson was at home reflecting on the recent award ceremony. The words of gratitude and recognition he had heard still echoed in his mind. He knew his journey was not just about personal achievements, but also about representing a larger fight for equality and respect. Meanwhile, Robert Miller, though surrounded by his family, felt more isolated than ever. He had watched the ceremony on television, each compliment to Marcus striking like a dagger in his conscience. Shame consumed him, and the anger he had once nurtured transformed into a desperate desire for change. That sunny afternoon, Miller decided he needed to step forward in public, not just as a businessman, but as a man who recognized his mistakes. He organized a community event at a local center, inviting everyone to discuss and confront the racism that still permeated society. Deep down, he knew it was an attempt at redemption, but also a necessary step to free himself from the burden he carried. "If I don't face this now, I'll never have peace," he murmured to himself, determined to do the right thing. The day of the event arrived and the room was full. People from diverse backgrounds were present, some curious, others skeptical about Miller's true intentions. He stepped onto the stage, his heart racing as he felt the audience's gaze upon him. The atmosphere was tense, everyone awaiting his words with anticipation. The businessman took a deep breath and began, "Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm here to talk about a topic that haunts and embarrasses me: racism. Recently, I had an encounter that made me question everything I believed. I met a man, General Marcus Thompson, who showed me that prejudice doesn't just limit itself to skin color, but is a disease that contaminates the soul." The audience murmured, some in approval, others in doubt. He continued, "I am not just a businessman. I am a father, a husband, and above all, a human being. The disdain I showed on a flight was not just an offense to Marcus, but a reflection of how I failed as a citizen. I allowed prejudice to define who I was, and for that, I ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness to Marcus, forgiveness to those I offended, and forgiveness to my family who saw the worst of me." As Miller spoke, the room began to stir. He looked out at the audience, his eyes meeting Marcus's, who was there, listening in silence. The general didn't know what to expect, but he was willing to listen. Miller felt the pressure rise, but he did not back down. "I'm not here to justify myself. I am here to seek redemption. My family and I have decided to support an organization that fights against racism. We need to change not just ourselves, but society as a whole, and I hope that by doing this, we can learn and grow together. To ustedes, silence filled the room for a moment, until a murmur of approval began to rise. Some people started to clap, while others remained deep in thought. Marcus, for his part, stood up and walked to the stage. Miller's gaze was filled with anticipation and fear. "Marcus, Miller began, but the general raised his hand, signaling for calm. "Robert, I appreciate what you're trying to do. The first step toward change is recognizing the mistake. I've made mistakes in my life too, and I know that transformation is a difficult process. What matters now is that you are willing to learn and change. That is what truly counts," Marcus said with dignity. The audience erupted in applause, and the tension that had hung in the air began to dissipate. Miller felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. He knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but now there was hope. The true revenge against prejudice was not hatred, but the ability to rebuild oneself, to forgive and to seek redemption. And so, on that day, two men from different worlds, but with a common struggle, took the first step toward real change. We've reached the end of this moving story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more accounts like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Right now, there's a playlist of videos on your screen. If you want to keep watching these touching stories, just click on it to start watching. And now, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and leave your like to support our work. Now, a sincere question. Do you agree with what happened in the story? We want to hear your opinion. Until the next video.